we're learning a Sicha, and as you know by now, we're not just learning Sichos in an arbitrary way, where every week we just learn a Sicha. We are learning Sichos to create a narrative, the story of the Torah. And like I said, we were doing it for 4 years. We did the Aves, we did Yosef and his brothers, and now we're doing the Exile and Redemption. And we spent forever on Exile. The most recent group of classes have been the emergence of the personality of Moshe Rabbeinu and Moshe Rabbeinu's task, Moshe Rabbeinu's mission. We learned about Hashem telling Moshe Rabbeinu to tell the Jewish people to borrow, and we had one more class last week. Remember what it was about? What was last week's class?
Revolutionary. And break the rules. Break the rules. Moshe Rabbeinu went to Paro and said, "You got all them."
You have to be a revolutionary. Break the rules. In other words, even if the rules for you personally work, sometimes the rules have to be broken. So what comes next in the story? So we learned about the exile, we learned about Moshe Rabbeinu, we learned about Moshe Rabbeinu's commission, what he was told to do. We even visited him. That Moshe Rabbeinu figured to make the rules. What happens next? He runs into a wall. The Pharaoh is not at all cooperative. He reacts in all the wrong ways. Right? According to the Midrash Chazal, the Pharaoh realizes right away that this Moshe may be a nuisance, but he's got good connections. Right? It says in Midrash Chazal it was impossible to enter into that palace, and he walks through the guards and all the shmirot, all the gates, effortlessly. He comes into the Pharaoh. So Paro realizes right away that he's going to have to deal with Moshe Rabbeinu. He can't just kill him. He can't just dispose of him, because Moshe Rabbeinu has demonstrated that he's got special powers. He's got connections to the Eibishter. But that in no way means that Paro is going to cooperate. It simply means Paro is going to have to deal with him. So now starts a whole new piece of the story. The negotiation between Moshe Rabbeinu and Paro. It's a part of the story that recurs in the end of Shmos and the Va'eda and the beginning of Boy in a variety of different levels. Okay? So let's start from the beginning. Now, to be sure, there's no Sicha on what I'm about to say, but it needs to be said, so we'll say it whether or not there's a Sicha. This is one of those pieces of the story which I found in Medrashim. It's found in Rishonim. So even though there's not a direct Sicha, at least not in the Rebbe's edited Sichas, on this we will now explore it. And that is, Moshe comes to meet the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh says, "Oh, you're a powerful guy." Now remember, what did the word power mean in the ancient world? Connected to the gods. That's what it meant. You have spiritual connections connected to the gods. So now, imagine Moshe and Paro figuratively, not actually, but figuratively, sizing each other up. They're figuring each other out. Moshe is trying to figure out how powerful is the Pharaoh. And by the way, Moshe Rabbeinu discovers that the Pharaoh is incredibly powerful. The fact that his forces come from evil in no way diminishes how powerful Paro is. By the time you get to Parshas Boy, in other words, he's given him 7 makkos, and the Paro is falling apart. Moshe is more afraid of him than ever, according to the Zohar. And we'll get to that point in the story when we get to it. So Moshe Rabbeinu himself is sizing up the Pharaoh and realizing, when it says Zelu Umazeh Asa Lakim, he really means it. When God created equal good and evil, Moshe is an incredibly good force. The Pharaoh is an incredibly evil force. And it reaches a point where Moshe is afraid of him. But we haven't gotten to that point yet. Moshe doesn't have a full assessment of the Pharaoh's full powers, and he's not yet in a state of complete fear from him. So he approaches him courageously with the power of God that allows him to get by all the checkpoints and all the rest. He enters into the Pharaoh's inner world and engages him in a conversation. Now let me insert an aside here. I want to say something tangentially. Even though it's premature, it doesn't appear in the biblical narrative in Shmos. I want to say it now because I want to set it up. When you discuss Moshe meeting the Pharaoh, there's 3 conditions. Number one, he meets him by the river. Number two, he meets him, I'm not sure where. And number three, he meets him in his throne room, in his palace. And when I was a child, I remember being a kid learning about this. What is the significance of Moshe Rabbeinu meeting the Pharaoh by the river? So there's two aspects to it. The first aspect to it is, and this of course what we enjoyed as children, the Pharaoh said that he was a god. All the Pharaohs were gods, but this guy said, I'm an extra god. What was the proof that he was a god? He never gave anything out. Whatever he took in, he kept. Right? There was no excrea. There was no passing anything out. How did he get away with it? Every morning he went down to the river, and when he came to the river, the water of the river would rise, and no one would see him. So Moshe Rabbeinu calls his bluff. Shows up in the bathroom. So as little children, this was the way we appreciated the story. He was making a joke out of him. I had an incredibly holy second grade Muhammad, really a very holy man. His name was Rabbi Reinsteck, he was a Belter Chassid. And he made this so vivid, so alive, so real, we could almost see it. You know, it's not comfortable. He caught him in what they call a compromised position. But he was calling his bluff. He was laughing at him. But there is a much more spiritual component to this meeting. Why? Because the Nile actually was the god of Egypt. They worshipped the Nile. And if you're familiar with the history of ancient Egypt, and I know a little bit about it, which means I don't know much, but I know a little bit, the Pharaoh's entire power was the belief that he controlled the river. Do you know that if the annual flood didn't come, they would kill the king? That was the tradition. If you were the king in Egypt, and it came the season for the flood, the Nile used to flood the delta. Right? The river, the Nile, runs from south to north. Okay, it's 1,000 miles long. There's the Blue Nile and there's the Green Nile. They come from two different sources. They converge at a certain point and they flood into the Mediterranean. And every season, every year, the drainage from the snow that's in the center of Africa and the overflow of water spills down into the valley and goes all the way into the sea. It brings so much water that it floods the entire land on both sides of the Nile for several miles. The consequence of this is that the Nile River Delta is some of the most fertile land in the world because it brings with it an enormous amount of soot. When the waters recede, you don't just have moist earth, you have mud. That mud is organic, it's living, it's the best material for growing things. And of course the Egyptians didn't only use it to produce foodstuffs, they used it to create their famous mud bricks, which the Torah describes that the Jewish people, where did the mud come from? There was no shortage of mud, there was an annual flood. The king, the Pharaoh, was considered the god, the embodiment of the god that brought the flood. Now, sometimes the flood wouldn't happen. If there was a very, very arid year in the center of Africa, the center of East Africa, that would be, the river didn't flood. If the river didn't flood, they killed the king. The king who cannot make the flood is not a king. They would literally kill him. So he worried about it. Now he, of course, had no control. He had a pretty good idea that he had no control. But he didn't tell anybody that. That would be stupid and foolish, right? This was his secret. He was the god. And the people bought it lock, stock, and barrel because for the most part the river would flood. So they were worshipping the river the Nile, and they were worshipping the king who was supposedly the overseer of this power. Moshe Rabbeinu shows up at the river the Nile and basically catches the king in an incredibly, shall we say, ungodlike condition. And it was a message. It was a message. Let's be real, as they say. We know who God is, and we go know who God isn't. And you ain't no God. That was the message. That was the mystical significance. That was the spiritual meaning of Moshe Rabbeinu reading the Pharaoh at the river. Now, there's another aspect to it, which is wonderful. This you have in Maimorim and Sichos. This is a very familiar thing. In other words, this is a concept which is very, very, sorry to explain, it's based on a puzzle. And that is, Egypt and Israel have very, very, very different topography, very different kinds of lands. Okay? Egypt is it's a plain. It's a flat plain. Flat. Now, The problem with a plain is there's no resource of water. And no civilization is without water. You have a plain and there's no water, it's a desert. The miracle of Egypt is the flood. That the rivers come from literally 1,000 miles away from Uganda and from Ethiopia and from East Africa. And there's a mountain range in Africa where the waters collect, the waters then come down into the valley, and one of the places they go is north. And that's how Egypt is blessed. Israel has a river called the Jordan, but the Jordan is not even a hiccup. The Jordan is an excuse me river. Now the Jordan is fed from waters coming from the north, from the hills which are, where are they? In Armenia, in Turkey, they're far away. And the kind of irrigation that the Nile can provide, there's very few waters in the world that can match that. So how does Israel live? And of course the answer is Israel has a spine, a mountain range. Mountains are very, very good for water because they capture clouds, right? That's what a mountain does. The clouds come and the cloud bumps into the mountain, it rises higher, and that's how it produces rain. So Israel's source of water, limtara shamayim timta eretz harim of kois, limtara shamayim timta. It's a pasuk. Because Israel has a spine, has a backbone, and has mountains, the rain comes from heaven. So of course the Rebbe talked about this much and said, if a person in Egypt wanted food, where did he look? Down. If a person in Israel wanted food, where did he look? Up. In other words, the physical topography of one land makes you pagan, and the physical topography of the other makes you a monotheist. In Egypt, you didn't need God. You had God flowing in the ground. In Israel, you're incredibly dependent upon God. When Yidden were tzaddikim, the supply of rain that came from heaven was so abundant that Israel was so fertile. It was so fertile, you were always walking in mud. The Chazal say, you pulled a potato out of the ground and there was a little puddle of water underneath. There was so much water. And of course, in the history of the exile, Israel has become a complete desert, a total desert, where nothing will grow. And of course, in the last 100 years, what the Jewish people have done in Israel is, it's beyond remarkable. It's the most amazing thing. I want to tell you parenthetically a beautiful story. The previous Rebbe was one of the most outspoken anti-Zionists in the world, one of the most critical anti-Zionists in the world, and really, really anti-Zionist. And he officially changed his policy after the Holocaust, and he explained why. It's not the time for me to go into it, but he was one of the most critical anti-Zionists in the world. I'm not going to say he hated the Zionists, but he certainly hated what they thought and did and believed. He visited Israel in 1929. He visited Israel. Now when he came to Israel, first of all, the Israel of those days, there were many, the percentage of Frum versus not Frum was higher. It was a very small community. There weren't that many Jews there. And there were the Zionists, and then there were the Haredim. And there was an unbelievable division between them. There was no meeting whatsoever. When Israel became a state, they became the Aguda, which is sort of like trying to be religious and get along with the Zionists, versus the radicals who didn't want to go with the Zionists. But before Israel was a state, there were these two camps. So when the Rebbe came, he was squarely in the camp of the Haredim, of the people who were very, very anti-Zionist. By the time he left Israel, half of them hated him, because he demonstrated too much open-mindedness. He was there 3 weeks. He came to Israel as the prince of the Jewish people, and he left Israel hated in many, many circles of Jews for a number of different reasons. Number one, he went to see Rabbi Kook.
Really?
That was a bad guy, or Kook was like, he was the religious Zionist, yes.
Did you not get along?
To the contrary, he went to see him. He befriended him, he embraced him. He disagreed completely. Rabbi Kook was the leader of the religious Zionists. The Rebbe never became a religious Zionist, but he separated the person from the mission. I'm not going to hate the person because he hated the... He didn't agree with Rabbi Kook. He met with him. They worked together. They collaborated. Rabbi Kook helped him. He went to America after Israel. Rabbi Kook created the connections with politicians and rich Jews in America. Rabbi Kook created bonds with the Fidi. When the Fidi Rebbe came here, he got connections from Rabbi Kook. They still disagreed, but they were people. But one of the things that
after the Holocaust, what do you do?
this is way before the
That's what
Holocaust.
I'm saying. You said he changed after the Holocaust. Would they have agreed then?
No, they would still disagree. The Rebbe is not a Zionist. We're not nationalists. The position of the Rabbeim is that there's no identity of the Jewish people that's not religious. Civics don't exist in the Jewish world. There's no civics, there's no politics, there's no secular leadership, there's no lay leadership. This is the position of our Rabbeim. Now, that makes you very nervous, but that's the fact. So this is an ideological debate. Can there be leadership, whether they're Jewish, religious, not religious, not the point. Is there such a concept as Jewish leadership, Jewish establishment, which is not directly connected to Torah? Our Rabbeim say absolutely not. So we're still anti-Zionist, but we're not anti-Jew, we're not anti-Israel. But the second thing that happened, which made him dislike, was he visited kibbutzim. And he saw Jews who were very shy, making the desert bloom. And there's a famous story, he visits a kibbutz, and he's walking around with all his Hasidim, who don't know what to think. This is one of the most outspoken anti-Zionists in the world. And he turns around, and he says to one of the Hasidim, "You're impressed? You're impressed?" That's what he's supposed to say. So the Rebbe says, "You can say you're impressed. I'm impressed." That's what he tells them. It's okay. These are Jews making Israel habitable. We'll deal with the issues later. I wish you could say it in Yiddish. Dir gefällt? Dir gefällt? You're impressed? You're happy? Mek sagen dir gefällt. Mir gefällt euch. It's okay. You can say you're impressed. I'm impressed. Now you have to understand how unbelievably surprising that was. Or to use the right word, how truly open-minded it was. The Rebbe said, this is our land, and these are Jews creating our land. I disagree with everything they stand for. I see them as the enemies of God and enemies of religion. But this is a good thing. And he had the ability to separate. Years and years later, the Kloisenberger Rebbe, who also was on the fence, said once, the Zionists we're building and we cursed. Now let us build and let them curse. It's just common sense. So now the point is that Israel, for much of history, was a desert. But when the Jewish people lived there and they served God, it was a Gan Eden. It was incredibly fertile. But it wasn't a reliable Gan Eden. Why? Because there was a condition. You had to do what God wanted. Rain came from heaven if God wanted. And it only came if you behaved. But if you behaved, you had more water than Egypt could have ever dreamed of. Egypt always had water, which means you didn't need God. That's why it was a land of pagans. So the Rebbe in his writings indicates and illustrates and underscores that the land of Egypt itself lent itself to paganism. And the land of Israel, by its very nature, begs, I need God. So Moshe Rabbeinu goes to meet the Pharaoh at the river. What's he telling him? You have absolutely no control. You're no God. You don't control the river. It's all happening naturally, and this whole thing is a game. So cut it out. Cut it out. Let's be real. Let's talk straight. And Moshe Rabbeinu, when he meets the Pharaoh at the river, is totally unafraid of him. He's calling his bluff. He's exposing him. Now, of course, Moshe Rabbeinu was told by the Eibishter a very interesting thing. Treat him with respect. He's a king. He was a piece of garbage. He was junk. He was nothing. Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, he's a king. Treat him with respect. And Moshe does. All Moshe has to do is take some pictures and put them up in the streets of whatever city they were living in. Look, this is your God. Look at me. Do me a favor. I met him in the Schwitz. But Moshe doesn't do that. He allows the Pharaoh to maintain his illusion, but he lets him know, you ain't fooling me. That's one place of meeting. The second place of meeting is never identified. Where they meet is not identified. It's a much more formal thing. It's not making a statement, but Moshe Rabbeinu is not afraid. You'll see much later in Pashas Boy that when Moshe actually goes into the actual palace to meet the Pharaoh, he's afraid. The Zohar says so. He's afraid. Because this is where he sees the real power of the Pharaoh, not the physical power, but the spiritual power. The Pharaoh had koiches atumah. Koiches atumah that could match Moshe Rabbeinu's koyach of kedusha, but you didn't see it in the river. You saw it in the palace. So there's a series of different levels to the meetings between Moshe Rabbeinu and the Pharaoh, which represent different levels of confrontation. So let's go back to the story. Moshe spends 80 years someplace else and just appears in Mitzrayim, and as I've told you so many times, one of the great anomalies of this story is that Dafka, a person who didn't experience the Golus at all, turns out to be the Redeemer. And he meets the Pharaoh, and they're sizing each other up. The Pharaoh says, this guy's tough. Not tough, he has big muscles. He's connected to some very powerful gods. But I'm also connected to powerful gods. So if I'm stronger than him, I'll behead him and it's over. But if he's stronger than me, I gotta figure this out. So they're sizing each other up. They're testing each other. And like I said to you before, the end of the story is that Hashem says to Moshe, Boy el Pari. Moshe is afraid of Pari, and Hashem says, I will go with you. Boy el Pari, come with me. Because at the very end of the story, Moshe finally assesses the full power of Pari, and he's afraid of him. So this is it's a very meaningful story. And again, it doesn't mean that little miniature man that was the Pharaoh. It means the spiritual powers of evil that were behind him. So here's the conversation. Moshe Rabbeinu comes to the Pharaoh and says, so has said the God of the Jews, or whenever he says God, it says, Shalach es ami v'yavduni, right? Let my people go and they shall serve you. They want to go 3 days into the desert and we'll be back. So the immediate response of the Pharaoh is, so besides for last week's conversation about l'chud l'siv l'seichem, follow the law, get out of here, and Moshe is breaking the law, the Pharaoh says, who are you? Like exactly who are you and who do you represent? Why should I even let you into my office and have a conversation with you? So Moshe Rabbeinu says, I represent Havaya. I represent God. So the Midrashim describe it, and this is a bit of a dramatization, if you will. The Pharaoh has a ledger, a big, fat, thick book made on papyrus or animal skins. He has all the gods. Got a whole collection of gods. And he says, okay, let's find out what your God can do. And they open up the encyclopedia of gods, and guess what? He's missing. He's not there. There's a great story with the Rebbe. In New York, there's something called the Union of Rebbes. Igud Ha'admoidim, the Union of Rebbes. So somebody once asked the Rebbe if he's going to participate in their annual meeting. So the Rebbe smiled and he said, I'm not a member. So God's not a member of the Union of Gods. So Pharaoh turns back to Moshe Rabbeinu and says, I don't know what you're talking about, but there's no such God. And Moshe says, oh, you better believe in such a God. He's just not a member. He's not part of your commission. He's not part of your collection. So the Pharaoh says, okay, so there's a God that's not part of the union of gods. Tell me about him. So in one sense, Moshe Rabbeinu says, he's the God of the supernatural. The God of miracles. And the Pharaoh says there's no such thing. Can't be. There's no such thing. Everything has laws. Everything is governed by rules. Even the gods have rules. Everything is. Everything can be managed. Everything can be negotiated. Everything can be created. Everything can be destroyed. A God that's above nature, it doesn't exist. And of course, the way Hasidus would develop the idea would be like this: the Pharaoh says to Moshe Rabbeinu, "I know who you are. Your great grandfather messed with my great grandfather. I know all that. And I got the. I know that this is not so. I can't just simply throw you out."
Who's his great-great-grandfather?
Avraham Avinu.
Oh.
If you said to me, you represent a Lekenu, or a Lekim, which means the God of all of nature, rather than the God of the land, and the God of the sea, the God of the sun, and the God of the moon, and the God of the day, the God of the night, the God of the winter, the God of the summer, and as they say in the real world, blah, 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 I would contemplate taking you seriously. Because the universal God of nature, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather met when he took your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. But the God you just described, it's not even in our tradition. Not only is it not in my book, not only is he a member of my union, not a member of my union, it can't be. There cannot be a God of the supernatural. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, first of all, there is, and you're going to get in line, or you're going to see what he can do. And that's the rest of the story, where Moshe Rabbeinu shows him the God of the supernatural. And what does the Pharaoh do each time? What does the Pharaoh do each time?
Challenges.
He insists that it's natural. He shows Moshe, I can do it too. Now what's the point of I can do it too? It isn't a miracle. And they argue, and they argue, and they argue, and they argue, and they argue. And the Pharaoh fights him miracle for miracle. The one miracle the Pharaoh cannot reproduce is lice. Kid.
Oh, yeah.
But think about this. Think about this. There's a lot more going on than the Pharaoh being a mean slave master who's an angry guy and a power-hungry guy who treats people worse than you treat animals. There is a spiritual battle taking place. Moshe is representing the Eibishter, and the Pharaoh, he's contending. He's fighting back. He's not just saying, I'm not going to listen. He's not just saying, I don't care. He's saying, I deny. I don't believe. Moshe does a miracle, he matches it. Moshe does a miracle, he matches it over and over and over and over again until he's convinced. When the firstborn died, the Pharaoh says, you know what? I don't know if I can reproduce this, but get out of here. It's enough. Too expensive, you understand? But that's the story of their meetings. So we'll continue this conversation next week. So of course, as you will acknowledge, we learned nothing today. We just told a story. But I want to set up what we're going to continue next week. What we learned today is Moshe represents Havaya. Moshe represents the God of the supernatural. The Pharaoh takes him seriously, denies he exists because he's not in the book, and shows repeatedly that every miracle Moshe Rabbeinu performs, he's able to do with his magicians, which means it's nature. It's not a miracle. It's just it's a manipulation of nature. It's an exploitation of nature. It's a trick of nature. And this is the game that Moshe and the Pharaoh are playing. Okay? But there's more to the story. What's the more to the story? As Moshe is contending the Pharaoh is contending Moshe and becoming more and more cruel. The Pharaoh is fighting with Moshe Rabbeinu and punishing the Jews for Moshe's efforts. So you have to remember we were holding.
He's not going to let us even